Hey viewers, and welcome back to another episode of The Model Guy. And in this episode, I'm going to be tackling Airfix's 148 Hawker Sea Fury, one of their best kits, so I'm told. Unfortunately, this kit is plagued with many of the issues that seem to follow Airfix around. Panel lines that are too wide or not consistent, grainy plastic, and raised details where there shouldn't be any, like the horizontal stabilizer or the vertical stabilizer, or around the exhaust here. I don't know if this is supposed to be some type of steampunk take on the Fury, but those aren't there on the real aircraft. Another thing that jumps out about the Sea Fury kit is that the nose cone is completely misshapen. It's definitely more blunt than the real aircraft. The engine cowling is also misshapen for this kit, so I decided to purchase some resin replacements from Barracuda Studios. But we'll get to that a little bit later in the build. Another shortfall of this kit is the molding line around the propeller. And we won't mention those massive sprue gates that have to be removed from a tight area and cleaned back up. There was also a short shot on the leading edge of the wing that had to be repaired as well. Here's a better angle on the grainy plastic texture that has to be cleaned up before you can do any painting. All the gloss coating in the world won't save you from that mess. Grainy texture isn't the worst thing going on for Airfix though. On my Sea Hurricane, the wings weren't molded with the curve to match the fuselage, and they ended up being 3mm too short at the trailing edge if I curved it to match. But hey, things have to get better with their 124 stuff, right? Wrong. Their 124 Hellcat also includes that grainy plastic, and that's going to be a lot of cleanup and say goodbye to those details that you're going to have to rescribe afterwards. Another fun thing with that 124 Hellcat is that a lot of the parts in the cockpit weren't long enough to fit in the proper place, so that would be some more cleanup in that kit as well. There's also no positive locations to tell you where the bulkhead is supposed to sit against the fuselage, and it's splayed outwards so it doesn't even fit tightly, so it might be a while before that 124 Hellcat comes to the bench. This might also give you an idea of why I'm not a fan of building Airfix kits. There's just a lot of stuff you have to clean up that should not be an issue. I can hear the Airfix fanboys now saying, hey, are you a modeler or an assembler? And guess what? If you bought a model kit that comes in a box, you are also an assembler no matter what you tell yourself. So let's move on to the Sea Fury. The cockpit of the Sea Fury is pretty tight, so I wasn't interested in doing much super detailing to this model kit. And rather than clean up the wiring on the molded parts, it was easier just to cut them off and replace them with lead wire. Before doing that though, it's also a good idea to clean up any surfaces that need super glue. Offset molding meant that the control column was going to need some work before it could go in the model. Telescoping brass rod was going to make this a pretty simple fix. Just remember to measure twice and cut once. You can always cut something shorter, but you can't cut it longer. I find the easiest way to cut brass tubing is to just roll it with a hobby blade. That way I get a nice clean cut and I don't end up bending the tube or crushing it. With the tube sections cut, I simply match them up against the plastic part to make sure everything measured properly, and then I cut off the actual handle and the base, and then glued them all together using super glue. And I let those sit overnight to make sure they had fully cured, because as you can see here, it's kind of delicate. After that, it was time to install some framework that Airfix simply omitted from the inside of the cockpit. I know their wiring was really large and oversized, but there should have still been something there. A simple styrene strip does the job. Lead wire is glued down with super glue and allowed to dry before bending to make sure it stays in place. And the nice thing about black super glue is after it's dried, you can find the excess and remove it easily with some debonder using an old brush. Just make sure it's a little bit of a stiff one. It also helps if you don't hammer down the super glue. My 3D printer has been offline now for about 3 months, so that meant that the Dremel lathe had to come back out to play its part. Just remember to have on your safety squint, because this stuff can come flying off and do some damage. A great Canadian once said, if women don't find you handsome, they should at least find you handy. I really need to get that 3D printer working again. The whole plan here is just to make the cockpit look busier than it did out of the box. The throttle was removed and replaced with a simple piece of styrene and brass rod, and then everything was primed in Mr. Surfacer Black 1500. For the base paint I used some AK Rio Colors Black 6RP because it's black but has a nice brown tone to it as well, so it makes it a great base for weathering. To keep things simple on this build, I only used 3 oil colors to dirty up the cockpit, and they were black, cream brown, and faded white. By putting the oil paints on cardboard, that brings out the seed oil that makes the paint glossy and hard to blend, and just makes it easier to work with. It just takes about an hour or so to do that, sometimes longer. So in the meantime, I did some dry brushing in the cockpit just to highlight the details. Because remember, this is all black, so it's going to be really hard to make everything pop. There's not too much detail going on in the cockpit for this kit, so it needs as much help as it can get. But at least Airfix didn't forget something important, like a gun sight. The seat back was painted with a mix of Vallejo model color, Russian uniform, and ghost gray. Here's my process for making washes from oil paints. I basically put a dab or two of oil paint onto my palette, then add a few drops of enamel thinner, and I keep doing this until the wash runs freely down the side of the palette. That lets me know that it's ready to go on. If you thin it too much, it just turns into a filter. Here you can see how the pin wash picks up all those little details and kicks up the contrast, just to make things interesting. This also has the added benefit of breaking the cockpit down into smaller sections to weather. Any excess wash can be simply blended or wiped away with a damp brush. The nice thing about that Russian 6RP black is it already looks quite weathered and faded, so there's really not much you have to do to make it look even worse. I'm adding a little bit more depth to the black by adding in some cream brown and faded white oils using the oil paint rendering technique, and since those are a little damp, I can use a Deerfoot stippler to blend them a little bit more. So let's talk about the Sea Fury for a moment. Why is this aircraft so special, and why do I have such an interest in it? And the reason for that is it's simple. It was one of the last piston engine aircraft to enter service before the jet age really started to take over. And the Sea Fury is one of the fastest piston engine aircraft ever made. The only one being faster, production-wise, was the P-51H Mustang, which had it beat by about 25 to 30 miles an hour. Although Canadian Sea Furies didn't partake in any combat action, they were a huge part of the Canadian Navy history and replaced the Seafire on board the deck of the Magnificent, and after a few years were replaced by the Banshee. Sea Furies did see action, however, in Korea, used by the Australian and Royal Navies. Even though the Supermarine Seafire had been tamed enough to finally operate off carriers, it had enough of a reputation that if several navies around the world were looking to replace it. The Canadian Navy at the time was looking between the Hawker Sea Fury and the Hellcats from the Americans. Now the rumor is the Hellcats were going to come very cheap with a lot of spares and training down in the US, but for one of the few times in Canadian history, we actually purchased a new aircraft for our military. You might be asking yourself, how bad is the fit of this cowling on the Airfix kit that I have to replace it with resin? Well, the short answer is it's pretty bad. If you line up the cowling with the fuselage halves and mount the engine, you're left with quite a gap. Yeah, there it is. It's about 2.5 millimeters. It would be an easy enough fix though. You would just have to cut one side, put in some styrene strips, and blend it. But the resin route's a much quicker and easier route to go. Another easy upgrade to the kit is replace the cannon barrels with hollow brass tube. I'm also not sure why Airfix does this, but these gates are huge on the wing, and on that leading edge, they're a real pain to clean up and get flush again. Just like the Airfix Mustang and the Mustang Madness series, all these joining edges of wings and rudders all have to be cleaned up and re-squared just to fit properly because they're not a clean 90-degree cut. But at least deleting rivets is as easy as using a chisel to make a few light passes until they're all gone, and then just sand them with some sanding sticks. I do have to give a shout out though to Jim Bates of Scale Canadian TV because he hooked me up with a lot of reference photos of the Sea Fury. So Jim, thanks again, buddy. All in all, it only took about an hour to clean off all these rivets. I just had to be careful that I didn't drive that chisel into the soft plastic, or else it would have been a lot more cleanup. Panel lines were pretty easy to fix with just a few passes with the razor saw. Unfortunately, there's not much I can do for the width. One thing that did surprise me about this kit, however, is that the wing to fuselage joint was very clean. No filler had to be used in that area. I'm not sure why Airfix put raised inspection hatches on the nose of the Sea Fury, but those were easy enough to sand down and rescribe. While other aircraft companies were starting to putty their rivets and clean up their airframes, Hawker still had all their rivets visible, and every reference photo that I looked at had the rivets visible. So that means out comes my trusty Rosie the Riveter tool, and every time I take this thing out, I always say it is my favorite purchase after my airbrush. You can take a $20 or $30 kit and immediately make it look like it's a $60 or $70 kit. There's just something very zen about rolling these rivets onto a plastic model kit. I just wish I looked a little bit harder at the references and realized that this thing has more rivets on it than the P47. So it took about 4 nights to rivet all this. Once the riveting was done, everything was sanded flush because the process pushes up plastic around the hole. So if you don't sand that flush, you'll have little dimples all over the aircraft. And this also serves as a good time to sand out the graininess of that Airfix plastic. It's very soft plastic, so it's not hard to work with. Just make sure when you're going up through your sanding sticks, you're hitting every grit. Being in naval aircraft, Sea Furies could get quite filthy, and even when they were based ashore, they tend to get beat up a little bit more. Maybe that's because there's snow and mud and all kinds of other stuff that can get drug off the ground into the aircraft. One fun fact about the Canadian Navy is they didn't use the same FS numbers as the US or the British, so the dark gray and light gray on this aircraft have to be specifically matched to a Canadian military number. After some digging around, I just simply compared some paints I put on a piece of styrene to the Sea Fury in the Museum of the Regiments. And the 2 colors I used were extra dark sea gray and light gray. Those are thrown on top of my usual color basing of cark tan, whites, grays, and what other fun colors I tend to throw in. Once the paints had dried, I then flat coated the model to make it easier to work with the pin wash. I find with a semi-gloss coat or a glossy coat, those pin washes just don't want to stay in place and just simply wipe away. The flat coat definitely has them biting down a bit more. After about 30 minutes, when all the pin wash had dried, I'd simply wiped it away with a shop cloth. What pin wash am I using, you might ask? Just another one made from oil paints using some patina blue and some dark gray. Any stubborn areas, I just dampened the cloth a little bit with enamel thinner, and it came right up. For the oil streaks on the bottom of the aircraft, I put straight oil paint onto tape and then used a dampened brush with enamel thinner and streaked it back, trying to be as straight as possible. If you want your oil streaks to be longer, you just put down more oil paint. The nice thing about naval aircraft, and maybe not so nice for the pilots, is there's a lot of pictures of Sea Furies standing on their noses after bad landings at the ship. So you get some good references of what the bellies look like. Once the oil streaking was done, I decided to break up the paint a little bit more by adding in some Starship filth along any hinges or access panels and blending it in with a damp brush again. And then I used some cream brown and faded white to break up the gray paints a little bit more and the decals. The decals I used were from Fun Decals, and unfortunately the first set I put on after they dried started lifting off the model, and the whole thing had to be stripped and repainted. Truth be told, stripping the paint and redoing it only set me back about 3 nights. Once again, I'm using some oil paint rendering just to make these panels a little less uniform. Places where they'd be exposed to the sun or salt when the wings were folded were beat up a little bit more. Painting the exhaust smoke on this aircraft presented a problem because it was a glossy metal paint right behind the exhaust stacks. So the first thing I had to do was use highly thinned flat brown / flat black mixed paint just to give the oil something to stick to, or else I would have just wiped off that panel. Once I was happy with the airbrushing and the direction that the exhaust smoke was going to go, I then started putting on some oil paints and softly blending them into place. One cool thing about Sea Furies is right behind the exhaust stacks, there's actually beige and black streaking from the type of fuel that the engine's burning. So to recreate that, I used beige and black oil paints and then softly blended them. The really nice thing about oil paints is if you're not happy with how it's looking, you can simply wipe everything away and restart, and you can't really do that with any other medium. So really it was 2 or 3 attempts before I was really happy with how this was going. And then the rest of the exhaust smoke was just broken up a bit with some grays and browns and then mixed with the Deerfoot stippler. I could have used just straight Abteilung 502 smoke, but I really liked how the browns and the grays make that area more interesting. And that's going to pretty much bring this build to a close. I would like to take this moment to thank my patron supporters who spend their hard-earned money supporting me in this hobby and bringing more content to you. If you're interested in early access to ad-free videos, definitely check that out. You'll also have access to high-def photos, blog posts, and general meanderings of what's going on in my mind. You'll also have direct line to me so you can ask any modeling related questions, and if I don't have the answers, I can help you find them. There's 3 tiers so you can join at any level. If you're unable to do that financially, that's fine. Just make sure you've clicked like and subscribe to this channel and hit the bell so you have all notifications for new content. You can also follow behind the scenes on my Instagram and Facebook accounts at Robbie the Model Guy. And as always, leave your comments and criticisms in the comment section below. Now, in closing, I may have badmouthed Airfix a little bit, and some people may be upset with that, especially the British, but here's the thing. I can always buy more glue or more paint, but the limiting factor with model building is time. That is one restraint that you can never change, and you only have so much of it. And when an Airfix kit's taking more time to fix things that are going past quality control that shouldn't, I'm no longer enjoying the build. I'd rather see it progress, enjoy it, and not have to be fixing things constantly. That's it for now. Have a happy and safe new year, and I will see you in 2022.